Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode on It's Lit podcast. My name is Daniela,
And I'm Lonnie.
and on today's episode titled The Lucky One and the Smart One, we are going to be discussing Lila Korman's graphic novel Unterzakhn, and we are going to focus on the diverging paths between the two twin sisters.
Yes, we're going to be discussing the education Jewish women were allowed to receive in the early 20th century, or lack thereof, and how this factors into Esther and Fanya's diverging/intersecting character arcs as the lucky one and the smart one. And also the way that Unterzakhn visualizes the Jewish woman's narrative through its representation of immigrant life on New York's Lower East Side. For our first topic, we're going to be discussing some of the themes of intergenerational cultural dissonance on the Lower East Side, specifically between an interaction between Mina, Esther and Fanya's mother, and Bronia, the local lady doctor. At one point, Bronia argues that the law says that Fanya and Esther should be going to school, while Mina claims that the girls don't need Goyish schooling when they can learn all they need to know from her. I think it's worth stating that schooling was sometimes tolerated for Jewish boys in the interest of getting them a better job, a better start in their career, but it was mostly viewed as useless for Jewish girls who were expected to learn all they needed to know from their mother. So I think it's worth stating that this sort of generational divide between Bronia and Mina stems from, Mina is a woman of her time. She's a woman of an older generation. She doesn't necessarily believe that her girls have anything to learn from American culture, and you can kind of see those struggles to assimilate within her characterization, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but to Bronia, who wants to give Fanya specifically the kind of education that she has, she's adamant about the fact that the girls, or at the very least Fanya, should be able to know how to read.
All right, so first I would like to point out she has more progressive values relative to that time period rather than Mina. So one of the values would definitely be the importance of highlighting women's health and women's education. So basically education regarding women's reproductive health. So she sees potential in Fanya to bring forward those teachings.
Yeah, she definitely sees Fanya as a potential student to pass that knowledge on to into the newer generation. And I think it's kind of interesting what Fanya ends up doing with that knowledge, and kind of how that factors into her own feelings about women's health and bodily autonomy, and kind of what she comes to stand for as an adult.
Absolutely, especially considering that from what we read, Fanya is definitely an eager person. She's very curious. She's been interested in wanting how to read. So that made her the almost perfect student for Bronia to teach.
Yeah, exactly. Even if that decision is kind of one of the first things that kind of separates Fanya and Esther as two different people.
Which leads me to my question. How has Fanya's access to education affect her path in comparison with Esther?
To answer that, Danny, I think that Fanya's access to education, well, her education wasn't exactly formal in the way that other people would view it, but she is able to learn from someone who has been, quote unquote, formally educated, Bronia. And so from this woman, she kind of learns everything she knows about the world and about men specifically, because Bronia is the only person that in Fanya's life that has responded to her curiosity and her desire to learn with actual answers. And so I think through Bronia, Fanya learns the importance of bodily autonomy, and ultimately how to provide help to women who need her, regardless of whether it's a safe thing to do. And so I think between Fanya and Esther, the education that Fanya receives, it gives her more autonomy in the sense that Her education impacted her other decisions in life, her desire to never get married or have children. But she still continues her relationship with her childhood love, Sal, um, which ends up kind of taking away some of her freedom towards the end of the book, when she decides to proceed with this pregnancy that she never asked for. Um, and it ends up kind of turning the tables between the dynamic between her and Esther, who at that point in the story, Esther has reached an amazing point in her career. She has all the freedom in the world. So I think Fanya's access to education almost kind of subverted the path that she was supposed to take in regards to her relationship with Esther.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to point out that the exact path that Esther took, as we know that Esther works in a brothel, she is a prostitute, and I think her not having the same access to education as Fanya really affected the way she viewed her and her own body. She didn't have the same level of bodily autonomy as Fanya has. And as a result, she was led into this path that what led her to be disowned from her family, including Fanya.
In regards to Esther, the education and the career that she was able to pursue did the opposite. It got her kicked out of her home. Her family and her community shunned her. And so I think it's worth asking after a lot of her formative years were spent with Miss Lucille, learning how to dance and how to satisfy the male gaze. After working there for so many years, she discovers through Meyer that Miss Lucille views her as nothing more than expendable. How do you think Esther weaponizes the education she receives from Miss Lucille to elevate her social status in the end?
Well, I think from the very beginning of the comic, we see that Esther has taken a special interest to Miss Lucille's dance company, which turns out to be more of a brothel. She started learning from Miss Lucille at a young age, and this level of education is way different from the education Fanya was receiving from Bronia. And when Esther started officially working for Miss Lucille, that ended up leaving her shunned from her home and her community, as you mentioned before. So as a result, Esther had to use what Miss Lucille taught her in order to survive in a sense, since she didn't have a home to turn back to other than Miss Lucille's brothel. But as soon as she discovers that Miss Lucille doesn't view her in as a person and views her more as like an object, she takes what she learns from Miss Lucille in order to make a living for herself, because she was very successful in the brothel. She was very popular among clients, and she was able to use her teachings in order to continue to do that, except she's able to make more money on her own and be a little bit more independent. So in the end, she is able to have more autonomy over herself in comparison to Fanya, despite Fanya having more autonomy with her own body by learning through Bronia.
All right, so to start wrapping things up, we kind of wanted to talk about the irony that surrounds the lucky one and the smart one labels that Esther and Fanya are given throughout their lives. We really wanted to talk about the fact that Fanya, though she is the more formally educated twin, ends up in more dismal circumstances than Esther, who really, by the grace of God and the luck of, I don't know, the universe, was able to get to where she was by the end. But yeah, I think you pose an interesting question there of if it is better to be smart or if it is better to be lucky. I guess I don't know. I think luckiness is kind of showing to prevail here. Book smarts can only get you so far. But I don't know, real life experience can kind of take you further. So I guess what I'm saying is don't go to college, kids. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Are you sure? All right. So with
A
that,
little bit.
we will
All right.
with that we will be we will be ending this episode here. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Daniela.
And my name is Lonnie.
you for joining this episode of It's Lit Podcast, The Lucky One and the Smart One.